All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm Kate McGee, the higher education reporter for the Texas Tribune. Thank you for joining us in person and online for our conversation on the fate of higher education this legislative session. We'd like to thank our today's sponsors, which include Lone Star College and Texas State Technical College. Major sponsors include Trellis Foundation, Texas 2036, Philanthropy Advocates, Raise Your Hand Texas, Educate Texas, Independent Colleges and Universities of Texas, Pearson, and the Texas Association of Community Colleges, and our foundation sponsor, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So lots of support here today, thank you. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite these events, they play no role in determining content, speakers, or lines of questioning. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our Texas Tribune members joining us in person and online today. We are grateful for your support. If you value events like these and you're not yet a member, please consider supporting the Tribune. You can go to texastribune.org/donate. We'll have about 40 minutes of Q&A here with our speakers, and then we'll have some time for audience questions. There's a mic over on the side, so I can, when I signal, please line up and ask your questions away to these panelists. And also, please silence your cell phones for those in person. And if you'd like to tweet from this event, please use the hashtag #TTEvents. Before I introduce our panelists here, we've had a few changes in our program. Representative Gary Van Dever and Senator Royce West were no longer able to attend. They had appropriations and Senate finance to attend to. And President Lesia Crumpton-Young at TSU had been called early this morning to speak in front of the House Appropriations, so she could no longer attend as well. Obviously, something's going on at the Capitol this month. But we are thrilled to be joined on stage by Harrison Keller, the Commissioner of Higher Education for the state of Texas, and Brenda Hellyer, Chancellor of San Jacinto College, the 8th largest community college in Texas. So thank you both for joining us. We appreciate it. Commissioner Keller, let's start with you. Texas is flush with cash right now, and higher ed is really vying for a piece of the pie this session. We have university systems asking for $1 billion in kind of extra funding. Community colleges are asking to overhaul the finance system, which has a $600 to $650 million price tag. How much love can we expect higher ed to get from lawmakers this session? And how are you, what are your priorities when you're pitching lawmakers about why they should be funding the higher education systems in the state?
Well, thanks, Kate. I appreciate it. So for me, this is my 25th year working around Texas public and higher education budget and policy in different roles. I'm more optimistic in this session than I've ever been. And when I've talked to folks who've been around even longer, I think there is a will and already demonstrated commitment from the policymakers to invest in higher education. So Texas is in a lot better shape than we've seen, and I think this is really sort of a once in a generation opportunity to invest in higher education. In states that have surpluses, though, generally the story has been that the states are in good shape, but maybe not as willing to invest in higher education. And so it already got some national attention that in the filed version of the House and Senate budgets, right out of the blocks, they had $650 million contingency rider to fund the full package of community college finance reforms that you alluded to, more than $90 million for healthcare workforce, $2.5 billion for emerging research universities. So our Texas policymakers, our leadership, already put a strong marker down that this is going to be an important session for higher education.
I wanted to ask about the $1 billion ask from the university systems. There were 4 areas that they were asking for additional funding, some to just put more money in the funding formulas generally. There are some programs like paying for veteran children's tuition, higher education insurance, employee insurance. And I'm wondering how receptive you've heard lawmakers to those requests so far, and do you feel like universities are shouldering too much of those programs over time that the legislature has put in place?
So there's a number of different proposals along these lines that have been floated. So the university systems had put a letter together and suggested here might be some areas that the legislature could focus funding on and that would enable the universities to freeze tuition for at least the next 2 years. Some of these areas you highlighted, so for example, on the Hazelwood legacy, so for veterans and their dependents, there are waivers in statute for tuition. But really, somebody has to pay for that education, and so it's shifted the cost really to the institutions. That's a significant burden for a number of both community colleges and universities. So if the state could fund those benefits for veterans and dependents, that would have a significant impact. And there's other things like the higher education group insurance, the formula rates. There's a number of other levers that they can pull. I think what's important for this conversation is important to sort of zoom out and look at so if we think about how that relates to the affordability for students, it's really got to be a shared responsibility among state, among institutions, and the students. So the state, yes, provides financial aid to students to help make higher education more affordable, but they also provide that direct funding for the institutions. And then the institutions set tuition, they manage institutional grant aid. A number of our institutions have guarantees and promise programs in place that rely on that state support. So I think this is going to be one of the key topics, especially over these next several weeks as they're putting the budget together, is how do you get all those pieces to come together so we can improve affordability for students and better support our institutions.
You know, universities are saying they'll hold tuition flat for undergraduates for the next 2 years if they get this funding from the legislature. But we've been hearing in these different appropriations meetings a lot of university leaders talking about housing being actually the real cost driver for a lot of students. So is this really going to make a difference in the affordability when it comes to the amount of money that students are paying if they're keeping tuition flat when housing is really the problem?
So the short answer is yes, but I think just to underline a really important point. So tuition hasn't really been the driver the last couple of years of why families feel like higher education is becoming out of reach. So tuition's been actually pretty flat, and we have some institutions that haven't raised tuition in a number of years. But general inflation, the transportation, the groceries, and especially housing. We've seen housing go up between 5% and 30% in some markets, and that's why a lot of folks are feeling squeezed. So the reason I say yes, though, that providing the support to institutions, providing these investments in higher education actually does still improve affordability. So we get back to what kinds of guarantees we're making to students on the financial aid side. And the way we package financial aid in higher ed isn't just based on tuition, it's based on that total cost of attendance, including housing, including transportation, including books. So when we can provide additional support to the institutions and additional financial aid, that also helps offset those other costs.
Chancellor Hellyer, before we jump into community college finance, which I know is a huge part of what you're talking about this session, what are other priorities for community colleges that you're looking at in terms of legislation this session or budgetary things that are on your radar?
Well, for the community colleges, and there's 50 of us across the state, Community College Finance Commission is absolutely our top priority. There was a lot of work that was built into that, tremendous work over the last 18 months, and that is the priority. From another standpoint, we're looking at legislation as it's being developed from, are there policies that are coming forward around transfer? Transfer is still important for us. Additional funds just around training components, but it really is the Finance Commission that is our priority. We do have concerns around some of our programs and clinical spaces and just making sure how those opportunities are still available to us. Is there legislation to help with those, to manage those a little bit differently? And we're always keeping our eyes out. Is there something that we need to stop that could really have an impact on us? But again, the Community College Finance Commission is our top priority.
I wanted to ask about clinical spaces. That was an issue that multiple university and community college leaders have brought up. Can you explain what the tension is there and why there has been such an issue getting clinical spots, especially when we hear about nursing shortages and the importance of getting more nurses, into the workforce?
Well, there's tremendous demand, and through COVID, a lot of the clinical spaces were lost, and so we did a lot more simulation, but we need to get our students out into the hospitals. And so there's demands there. There's, when we talk to our hospital partners, there are part of their floors that are closed up still because of nursing shortages, so they have limits on what they can do there, and we're all competing for that space. And then if you have proprietary schools coming in and also trying to use that space, so we're all just competing for the same components. So it really is, how do you manage your partnerships? How do you manage that space? And one of the things we've heard from our hospital partners, while simulation helped us through COVID, made sure our nursing students were getting those experiences, they need the hands-on. They've got to be in those hospital rooms. They've got to be able to understand the real emotional intelligence and the emotional capabilities they need in dealing with patients. So it's a competitive market, and you got high demand, you got nursing shortages, and you've got just, again, everybody fighting for the same space.
Senator Mays Middleton has filed a bill that would lift the cap on the number of bachelor's degrees that community colleges can offer. Currently, it's 5 right now, I believe. Does your school want to offer more bachelor's degrees? I believe you offer one in nursing right now. Is this something that community colleges have been asking for?
So there's a lot of interest around bachelor bills, and we do offer a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. We are adding also a Bachelor in Education. The board just approved it, and we're working through that process. And again, trying to help address the nursing shortage, or the teaching shortage. So one of the things when the bachelor bills for community colleges were put in place, there was that cap of 5. There was also some limits around what your taxing value had to be in order to have capacity to do that. My understanding from Senator Middleton is that he would like to eliminate that cap around the property taxes, and he feels there needs to be more flexibility for community colleges to meet community needs. For my college, we look at these bachelor bills, these bachelor programs very conservatively. We try to make sure how we're meeting the workforce needs. And if there's a demand, we're going to respond that way. And so there is a difference between community colleges throughout the state and what they see as opportunities with this.
How does the coordinating board view this? Because I think if this is changed, you guys would have to still approve what these colleges are.
Sure, and I think that's important for folks to understand. So one of the functions of the Higher Education Coordinating Board is that we're what's called the authorizing entity. So, so if the colleges want to offer new bachelor's degree programs, or if universities want to stand up a new school, then they have to get approval from the coordinating board. And part of our charge is to look at like what the needs are across the state and in the region. Is there undue duplication, and try to help kind of mediate some of those issues if you do have tensions. But what Chancellor Hellyer is talking about is not just suddenly shifting the mission of the community colleges in the direction of now offering bachelor's degrees. I think that was the concern when this first came up, and again, all the community colleges are different, but we haven't seen dozens and dozens of bachelor's degree programs from the community colleges. So the proposal, as I understand it from Senator Middleton, is really about trying to provide more flexibility, so where appropriate, the colleges could propose new programs, but they're going to notify us that they're planning those programs. We're going to be in close dialogue. We're going to be sharing information with them about workforce needs, and then ultimately those would have to be approved. So there's a whole process that we'd have to go through before those programs would be live.
I think about nursing in particular. We're hearing about the shortage and the fact that we also hear that schools are turning away nurses because of capacity issue, and so the idea of being able to start a new nursing program seems great. maybe that would address that need. However, then we also hear that we have a nursing faculty shortage. And so how do you kind of balance that tension of needing more space for students, but then not having the teachers to actually teach them?
So part of this whole nursing shortage has also changed. When we created our Bachelor of Science in Nursing, it was because our hospitals were moving towards wanting those Bachelor of Science in Nursing. They were moving toward magna status. That has still been a priority for our hospitals, but as I talk with them, I have been nervous in the past, before we did the BSN, that a LVN, a licensed vocational nurse, would no longer be in demand. That eventually our associate degree nursing, which is an RN, would no longer be in demand. As I talk to hospitals, that's not the situation. They have changed their models through COVID. They're still working to change that model now. What's it going to look at? So there is a need for a CNA. There's a need for an LVN, an ADN, a registered nurse, and the BSN. And so really designing that pipeline and making sure how you're meeting those needs of your hospitals and your community. One of the things the Texas Workforce Commission has also put together a program for nursing apprenticeships, put aside about $15 million for that. And we're piloting that kind of a program with one of our hospitals right now to, again, trying to address some of these components. As far as the nursing faculty shortage, we've got shortages in other areas, and we're just constantly competing. Part of it is making sure we do market stipends. Part of it is working very closely with our hospitals, and as their nurses are retiring, having them come on with us. So it's about, again, those partnerships. But there's different requirements for nursing faculty based on those different levels. And the BSN, if it's an add-on to an associate degree of nursing already where they've got their registered nursing license, there's not a lot of clinical space. It's mostly classroom. And so there's differences. I think it's just being able to listen to your hospital partners and then responding.
I want to talk a little bit about COVID, federal COVID funding that is ending. Has the state or the coordinating board been able to quantify how much the direct student financial aid made a difference keeping students in school during the pandemic, and how that information has helped you kind of craft your ask to lawmakers about the state financial aid programs and the importance of funding those to keep students in school?
Let me, so I want to talk about that, but also want to emphasize a couple of points that Chancellor Hellyer just made, actually, that are connected to the federal funding, because so to tackle this issue about the nursing shortage, we've really got to work on multiple parts of the pipeline. That includes financial aid, it includes loan repayment programs, it also includes innovating that pipeline of future faculty. And so one of the areas that the leadership prioritized, especially with the more flexible Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund, or the GEAR funds, was around the nursing shortage across those multiple fronts. And then building on that work, then you see that even in the filed version of the budget, both the House and the Senate are leaning in to like loan repayment programs and working on other parts of that pipeline. But so this is something that we have to tackle on multiple fronts. So one of the things, so then back to the financial aid issue. So one of the things that we were able to do in Texas that's different from a lot of other states with those federal stimulus dollars is Texas was one of only few states that prioritized higher education for more flexible stimulus dollars. So ultimately, by the time all of the funds are expended, it'll be more than $360 million entrusted through the coordinating board for higher education. About $200 million of that for student financial aid. Now, some of that early in the pandemic, we had students whose family situations had suddenly changed. There was a question about whether students would be able to stay enrolled. We had students on the verge of dropping out. And so when those stimulus dollars came down, then we were able to work in close partnership with the institutions, and within a few days get funding out to about 60,000 students to help keep them enrolled at our 2-year and 4-year institutions. So there was first an initial infusion of emergency aid to the institutions, and I want to commend our community colleges and our universities for their flexibility. Everybody was sort of all hands on deck as people are working from home and trying to figure out how we navigate all these issues to keep our students on track. Now, another thing that we were able to do around student financial aid on issues like nursing, but other critical areas like financial aid for transfer students or financial aid for high-achieving low-income students that we saw weren't enrolling directly in colleges at the rates that we'd like to see, is that we were able to pilot some more innovative approaches working with the institutions and doing extensive evaluation of what that impact is like, so that now as the legislature is trying to decide, well, where do we put recurring funding, so we can see that when, for example, when you have portable financial aid that'll follow a transfer student from a community college to their university.
Because that wasn't happening, right?
It wasn't. So that was a gap in our financial aid program. So we had a financial aid for our 2-year institutions that has been severely underfunded. We're only going to fund about 28% of the eligible students at the 2-year institutions. And then at the 4-year institutions, this year, through Texas grant, we'll fund about 72%. Does that mean that transfer students were really falling through the gaps? So a lot of students.
And that's because by the time they got to the 4-year school, there was no money in the Texas grants left for them to pick up.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we were seeing is students who started at a community college and transferred to the university versus students who started in the university, and both of those groups of students ending up in many cases with about the same amount of student loan debt at the end. So if students felt like, well, I'm going to start at the community college, I'm going to save money because the financial aid wasn't available, actually ended up they had to take on more debt. So this was one of the issues that we zeroed in on in the last legislative session, and they allocated GEAR dollars for us to start tackling that, working with the institutions, and then now feeds into discussion about how do we build in more recurring funding to make sure that the transfer students, in addition to knowing their credits are going to transfer, they need to know that the financial aid is going to be there so that they're going to not have to take on more debt than they can manage.
And is that going to be enough to kind of maintain the money that these students saw from the federal COVID financial aid, or will there be some kind of fiscal cliff that they're going to now be seeing, and how is the state or schools preparing for that?
Well, the federal aid that we got through COVID that went to students, I mean, that was at a whole different level, and we were at such a different place at that time. The real emphasis that's going to happen now is the extra funding in TEOG. That's going, and the Texas Education Opportunity Grant, which is one of the Finance Commission recommendations. As a commissioner said, right now only 28% of eligible students can get that financial aid. Well, in the recommendations, we're asking that be moved to at least 70%. That's going to help fill that gap. And the other thing with that TEOG, we're also asking that it have a lot more flexibility, that it can be used for continuing education programs, like a truck driving program, and so that it can be used more, that we look at the criteria so it can be used more for adult learners coming back. And so we really see that being the focus of those funds. Is there anything else?
Well, one of the things that I'd say also is putting more funding into the TEOG, adding that additional flexibility is incredibly important for students. We didn't have financial aid for students in those short-term workforce programs. So that's, again, during COVID, we were able to deploy, we had some hiccups along the way as we were getting dollars out, but we were able to deploy tens of millions of dollars to the institutions for financial aid for short-term workforce programs. And so now the proposal is, well, our recurring funding for TEOG, let's broaden the focus of that to include these short-term programs as well, and that would help students at the community colleges, also our TSTCs and our Lamar State colleges.
So expanding that to EOG funding obviously was one of the recommendations from the Community College Finance Commission. Let's shift to that being, the major focus for community colleges this session. Can you kind of broadly, since you served on the commission, kind of share the recommendations and what they are proposing that the state do to completely overhaul this system, and how that would be different than how the state, funds its community colleges right now? It's a big question, I know.
Very big question, and you jump in when you want. So, but the first thing I do want to say is I want to thank Commissioner Keller, and I want to thank Chairman Woody Hunt for their leadership on this commission. There were 12 of us, but it was really their leadership and making sure along the way how we were dealing with the issues, and then making sure how we were getting leadership support at the Capitol. And so the big buckets are that it's about a overhaul of the funding method. It's outcomes-based now. It will be a dynamic funding model versus a reallocation model, a resharing of the pie. So that's that's the first component. The other component is it's focused on affordability, more equitable access across the state. And then the third bucket is building capacity. And so when you start breaking those down, outcomes-based funding, community colleges, about 25% of our funding comes from the state. And then when you start breaking that down, in the past, only about 12 to 15% had been on any kinds of outcomes-based. The community college funding model hadn't been overhauled in about 50 years. So this outcomes-based, it will be that about 90 to 95% of our funding from the state will now be outcomes-based. An institution like mine, it'll be 100% outcomes-based. Big components will be funded based on the credentials and the degrees that we award, so certificates and degrees, from certificates that get you into the workplace, associate degrees, or our bachelor's that we're awarding. And again, making sure that there's a focus around the credit side of what we do, which are all those degrees, but it's also that continuing education workforce training. So I've thrown out a couple of times commercial truck driving. That is considered a continuing education or a non-credit program, hadn't been funded as an outcome before. That's an outcome now. The second area, there will be additional funding for high demand areas, and we're going to base those on regional high demand areas. Nursing, healthcare, that's going to be across the state. My area, petrochem, will probably be a high demand, and so we'll be basing that, so there'll be additional funding there. There will also be a third outcome that will be based on dual credit. So dual credit students taking 15 semester credit hours along a pathway, be it academic or workforce, will be funded, and then also for our transfer, because transfer is a big part of the mission of community colleges. A really other important key component of this is there will be additional funding in those areas based on students who are economically disadvantaged, academically disadvantaged as they complete the process, and then also adult learners coming back. Community colleges, those areas take a lot more support, right? And at community colleges, we are focused around that whole student, and so making sure that as we're moving students through, if there's additional supports, there's a recognition of that. Anything I missed on outcomes?
There's some details here and there that we could go. This is a massive overhaul, really sweeping reform of community college finance. And so a couple of points that I would just underline, really. So first is that the plan is designed to advance the broader goals that we set down as a state. So just about a year ago, we updated the state's strategic plan for Texas higher education. So the current plan now is called Building a Talent Strong Texas. So that we reformed the strategic plan for higher education to better align with what Texas needs from its institutions, and also align with what we see happening in our economy, in our job market. So in Building a Talent Strong Texas, we became the first state to condition our goals for producing credentials on the value of those credentials to individuals and to employers in our labor market. So
how do you define credentials of value?
Yeah, so we actually look at look into the wage data, and so we look at what are the wages look like for an individual that has whatever the credential is, whether we're talking a short-term workforce credential or a traditional degree, and we net out the costs of earning that credential and ask the question, well, are you better off when we look at what the wages look like in Texas for folks who only have high school diplomas? So underlying all of this work is some sophisticated analyses around our wage data, because we have incredibly rich data in Texas that we leverage right now only in one narrow area around our funding for our TSTCs. So now what we're doing is leveraging that data from a much broader swath of our institutions across the community colleges to set that baseline. Now, in addition, there are areas that are of really high demand, and so there would be additional funding for those high demand fields. But again, like what you don't want to do is put a marker down and say, well, we're going to pay for outcomes, but not put those guardrails around it, and then just make up a bunch of credentials and claim that you're making progress. So it's already been established, and going into the work on community college finance, we want to make sure that this is aligned with the mission of the community colleges to serve their communities, to serve our state, especially in producing the workforce of today and tomorrow. And that's an important part of the recommendations. Now, doing that, one other thing I'll say. So we have generally been funding the community colleges just based on inputs, just based on the types of courses that they offer. And that means as they innovate their programs, as they streamline their programs, do more credit by exam, do more competency-based education, reduce students' time to completion, the states responded by cutting their funding. So in an outcomes-based model, basically we're saying is if you can do cheaper, better, faster, then there should be an upside for that. So we're trying to clear the regulatory brush, clear the way for the community colleges to work in close partnership with the employers, streamline those pathways to credentials, and that award of that credential of value, that would be the primary basis for how the community colleges would be rewarded, not seat time.
There is some research, though, on the performance-based funding models that shows that it really benefits colleges that are serving students who are already doing well and might not have, disadvantages. And so how have you advised lawmakers as they're crafting this legislation, since we have not actually seen it yet, to make sure that this overhaul doesn't hurt schools who are educating higher risk students, more disadvantaged students?
So in the work on the commission, and really, again, I want to commend Woody Hunt for his leadership as the chair of the commission. Was really excellent, both because of his long experience and also because he was intimately involved in updating our goals and setting our targets for higher education around building and talent strong Texas, and even some of the previous plans. And so we took the deepest dive into community college finance that any state has ever attempted. Commissioned technical analyses. We polled the Texas public. There was one of the important areas that came out of these discussions is that our rural colleges are in very, very different cost environments than our urban colleges. So there was a whole strand of work to dig deeper into what are the cost pressures, what are the needs of our rural communities. More than half our Texas counties actually lost population over the last decade. And that's as Texas added more residents than any other state. But that growth's really been concentrated in 10 counties. So you have different kinds of cost pressures if you're in a high growth urban area than you're in a rural county. So how do we make sure that we're equitably supporting our colleges? We talked to national experts and representatives from all of the states that have been leaders in outcomes-based funding, and I'm really proud of the recommendations that came together on this point about how do you make sure that you don't fall into where you're funding colleges in ways that are going to disadvantage colleges that serve rural communities or colleges that serve large numbers of students who are low income. So the Texas proposal builds in evidence-based adjustments and weighting to account for some of the diseconomies of scale if you're in a small community, to also pick up those additional costs. If you have a student who's comes from a low-income background, or an adult who's been out of school for a while, they're going to need some additional support to be able to be on track and to be able to complete that program in a timely fashion. The state had provided zero support for those kinds of additional services, really just sort of pushed it back on the local communities and on the colleges to self-fund that sort of work. So now there'd be additional state funding to help pick up those costs. So I think what we've come up with, with all due humility, is far superior to anything that we've seen in any other state.
I think there's an important point there that Commissioner said, though. These rural colleges, we went into this, we wanted to make sure all Texans were going to be able to be served. And so this foundational funding that has been built in also for rural colleges, based on looking at what are they able to generate from a local revenue standpoint, and then there being some kind of foundational funding to give them additional supports, was really an important concept, again, because we wanted to make sure that all regions were going to be served. And the other part of that, on that foundational funding, there's also some requirements for those colleges that they will look at and participate in other shared services to gain some operational efficiencies in their operations, maybe looking at how they can partner with other colleges in expanding offerings and sharing in offerings. And so it was really looking at that broad. We wanted all parts of Texas to be served because we had to be competitive across the state.
What happens if this model is adopted and a school is just really struggling and they are not serving their students well in terms of getting them to transfer to a four-year school or getting a credential? Is there, on the K through 12 side, we see the TEA can take over a school if they want, a district if they want. Is there discussions about whether the coordinating board would step in if a school was really struggling under this model with outcomes-based accountability?
No interest in taking over colleges, taking away their mascots, any of those kinds of things. That's never been under discussion in any meeting I've been in. And that's not an authority the coordinating board would seek. So the outcomes-based funding model is proposed, would be dynamic, and that could mean that colleges could leave money on the table. But you do have to build in some protections. For example, like say you're in a smaller community and you have a major employer suddenly relocate. So overnight, all of a sudden enrollment could drop suddenly. Well, you want to make sure that you haven't suddenly pulled the rug out from under the college. So you have to have, so you need to have some provisions built in there to at least kind of soften that blow, and make sure that there's some protections where you can smooth out over time. So that's also built into the recommendations. Also, again, this is a major shift. This is a historic overhaul of community college finance. And one of the principles out of the blocks is, first, do no harm. So no college would end up losing money as a result of making this shift. And so there would be an infusion of new funding to the community colleges to get this outcomes-based model going, more horsepower in the system, if you will. So no college would be harmed, and I think over time what we'd have is a much more dynamic, more flexible model with protections built in if you have shocks due to kind of things beyond the college's control.
I think another important component of this is the community colleges asked for this commission. We knew our funding model was not sustainable, and so we asked for it. As far as outcomes, all 50 community colleges are supportive and behind these recommendations. Are we nervous? Sure. Anytime you see change, it's nervous. But one of the things is community colleges in this state have been focused on students completing. We've been focused on access, success, and completion. That's who we are. The state has a Texas Success Center. Many of the funders of Texas Tribune are also helping to fund that. And that work has been around what do we need to do to better serve our students, and how do we need to make sure that we're meeting our community needs, focused around success and completion and access. And so we've been doing the work. There's always more work that needs to be done. But we're going into this 100% committed, and that this is going to be better for the students, better for the state, and better for our communities.
So this is also something that has gotten some national attention, because when I go and I talk about this work at different conferences or meetings, like one of the questions folks will ask is they'll say, well, but you're talking about you're using wage data and Texas is proposing to go to an outcomes-based formula and this radical overhaul to a dynamic funding system. How do you overcome the opposition of the colleges? And everyone's stunned to hear that, no, this has been developed in close partnership with the colleges, and all 50 of our community colleges, from our smallest colleges to our largest colleges, are all strongly supportive of the direction that we're heading. That's something also you do not see in other states.
Senator West, which I was going to ask him if he was here, he mentioned at the Senate's Finance Committee that community colleges had maybe not been on board with this idea of performance-based funding for a while. Is that true, and what maybe changed the perspective of the leaders to be supportive of that?
So community colleges, we made a change about 10 years ago to go to student success points, which was a form of outcomes-based funding. And it represents 12 to 15%. Actually, I think this last biennium, about 17% of our funding. The one thing we found with that model was that it wasn't being funded as it was truly performance-based. Our successes increased, our funding rates went down. And it became very much the same kind of old allocation model. And so I think the difference is this is a whole new model. It's a total shift. It's transformational. It's bold, and it's going to direct the state into being competitive in the marketplace. And the other piece of it is we're relying on the state funding it. I mean, this is the $650 million of new dollars that are built into this budget are a big statement, and it really becomes outcomes-based funding that's funded. That's where community colleges are supported.
I want to shift. We have a few more questions before I want to ask audience questions. If you would like to start lining up here, if you have questions, please do. We can shift to you. I know you are very focused on policy. A lot of the news lately, though, around higher education has been around more political conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion on campuses, whether that's in hiring or DEI offices on campus. There's legislation to maybe defund those offices. And I'm wondering, from both of your perspectives, since community colleges serve a very diverse group of students, if there is concerns of removing some of those offices or those committees that are happening on campuses, how that might impact the state's goals to get to 60% of Texans having a degree or credential by 2030, if we are not embracing and focusing on making sure that we are serving the diverse population that's coming in, that we know is coming up through the K-12 system now.
You want to take this one first, or you want me to?
Oh, no, go ahead.
So we're an institution. We're 64% Hispanic enrollment. We're a little over 10% Black enrollment, and we've got to serve our community. Even the bigger factor of that is we're about 45% first generation, and when I look at my feeder high schools into San Jacinto College, the majority have about 80% free and reduced lunch. Those are all issues of how do you serve a diverse, inclusive community. How do you make sure you have equitable outcomes? And so we're looking at that across all those dynamics. I think poverty is probably one of the greater things that hold our students back. And so we're looking at how do we serve, again, all students. The commission report addresses economically disadvantaged, academically disadvantaged, and adult learners. I also think first generation is critically important. And so that work has been a focus of San Jacinto College, of our board. And yes, we do have a DEI officer, and we do DEI work across, but it's really looking at all those avenues. It's about serving all of our students and all of our community. And so we're watching what's happening, but I believe that we are doing the right thing for our community. And we need to continue to challenge ourselves and our faculty. You know, what's being used in the classroom? What are the examples? Are we really, even from an age, my youngest graduate was 15 earning an associate degree in December. My oldest graduate was 72. Think about the examples that you want to have in your classroom. And so diversity is that whole broad range. And sure, we're watching things, but again, I believe what we've been doing is the right work.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, like Texas added more residents than any state, right? So we added about 4 million residents over the last decade. 95% of that growth was in communities of color. And so if we're not advancing the goals that we've set for ourselves in educational attainment, in folks earning credentials of value, if we're not advancing that so everyone has an opportunity to participate in, contribute to, benefit from our state, we cannot meet our goals because of math. So part of our role at the coordinating board is that by statute, we're the stewards of the state's combined educational workforce data infrastructure. We have incredibly rich data, and we've worked hard especially over the last couple of years. One of the things we've worked on the state infrastructure side is to bolster that infrastructure so we can leverage that data to inform these policy conversations, like about community college finance, to reflect better information to the institutions, and also to power new advising tools. And it's important that we break that data down by race and ethnicity, by sex, and also by income. This is something we have a long tradition of this in Texas, especially on the K-12 side, where for decades we're accustomed to breaking that data down because we have to hold ourselves accountable not only for how we're advancing on the average, but are we making sure that we're advancing those opportunities across the board. Sometimes that data is pretty painful. So sometimes, we actually just provided initial reports to the institutions, and we're trying to work with them on how do you want to see this information, and what kind of data would help you within the institutions. When do you need to receive it, in what form? So we put preliminary reports together on things like distributions of student debt and break it down by student demographic. And there's institutions where you don't see much difference with male and female. You don't see much difference across race and ethnicity. Then there's other institutions where you see some pretty wide disparities. So it's going to be important that we shine a light on that, not to try to embarrass anybody or threaten to take their mascot away or something like that, but so that we know where to focus the resources and within the institutions, across the institutions at the state level. So this is something that we're not backing away from. If anything, we're leaning into this work of making sure that we are giving everyone that opportunity. I don't get from policymakers at all an interest in shifting that focus.
But hearing, at San Jacinto having a DEI officer, many universities have DEI offices that are doing work to get students to graduate. That's basically a lot of their goal. Do you feel like the conversation or the accusation that these are ideological centers is hurting the goals that you are trying to achieve when it comes to the math that you say, we need to focus on getting students of color and other diverse students to graduate?
So folks organize their institutions differently within colleges and universities. Sometimes they organize student success at an institutional level. Sometimes with a vice president or a vice provost. Sometimes within the colleges. Some of these offices are leading major student success efforts at their campuses. And in many cases, that's not where those efforts are. The advising and student success is in might be in enrollment management, or it might be in student affairs. So folks organize their institutions differently. So I think I think it's hard at the state level to say, well, you want to eliminate a specific kind of office at the state level. You're really you need to look a little more closely at how the institutions organize themselves, what the functions of those offices are, what's included in those portfolios. Some of them, for example, are working on Title IX compliance that is going to have to live somewhere. That's a critical function within the institutions. And there's a lot of variation across the institutions and what the functions are, and frankly, how effective they've been or not.
I agree with the commissioner. With our office, it is really looking more broadly at things. I mean, you know, when we talk about math, my male students are the ones struggling in math. Now, so we have a male student initiative that we're working through. And again, it's just, I could call this work student success. I could call it about creating belonging. It's about access. It's so broad. And so I agree. It's very hard for somebody in a different agency to be looking at our structure and trying to figure out what we need to be calling it.
Gotcha. All right, let's turn to some audience questions. If you could come up to the mic and briefly introduce yourself and ask a question.
Thank you. Hey, is this on? Yeah. Thank you. My name is Randy Lee, and I'm here on a personal endeavor. I am a volunteer. Let me commend both of you first. I really enjoy this. You do a great job for the state of Texas, and I've learned tremendously today. But my question came out of hearing something yesterday. I'm the volunteer advisor at Texas State, even though I went to UT, in the sciences for various reasons. But they're an emergency research university. They've got to run to R1. And I'm going to get out on quicksand here. No one's mentioned the PUF fund. I know that's sacrosanct. But personally, and I've always felt this, long before I had an interest in higher education, that money is all of our money. And I know the folks at UT and Rice, although they're A&M, they're going to come after me. Not really, but is that, do you ever see, after seeing last night, the governor put $2 billion in his budget. Now, I haven't seen it. It was released yesterday afternoon toward Texas Tech University and I believe University of Houston.
Correct.
But why can't that money be used for schools that meet some type of criteria like R2 running to R1 or even community colleges? Why can't it be available to all people? Do you ever see it moving in that direction? We've got billions of dollars that come from the oil and gas money in this state. I'm just curious.
You want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So this is a critical question. Thanks for asking, Randy, because how competitive we're going to be in the future absolutely is going to be about our talent pipeline, but it's also going to be about how well we can compete at the frontiers of knowledge, the frontiers of technology. Right now, we're the 9th largest economy in the world if we were still our own independent republic. And we have 3 institutions that are routinely counted among the top 200 in the world. That's just not going to be good enough if we're going to remain competitive. So it's going to be critical that we don't want to level down. What we want to do is lift more institutions up. You know, so that's even when he was a candidate for governor. That's why Governor Abbott put a marker down. We ought to have multiple Texas institutions that are counted among the top 10 public research universities. And so that's why it's particularly striking, right, that you have this consensus across House and Senate with the governor to put $2.5 billion down for the non-PUF institutions to help lift up more institutions. So Texas Tech, U of H, University of North Texas, Texas State University that don't currently benefit from the PUF institution. One of the things I really appreciate in the conversations with our appropriators, with our leadership, is the driving question that's come up again and again with Dr. Bonin, with Senator Huffman, with the Lieutenant Governor's office, with the Speaker's office. What are the investments that we need to make now with this once-in-a-generation opportunity that 30, 40 years from now, folks are going to look back and be glad that we made. And this is one of the areas where strategic investments to create new endowments that will grow over time, that will lift up more institutions, where that's going to be really important for the future. And I think it is well beyond a discussion about two institutions or just kind of a snapshot of a couple of institutions' endowment. I think there is a much deeper commitment from the policymakers to advance the ball on this issue.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for your answer very much.
Hi, Susan Dawson with E3 Alliance, and thank you for this panel. We appreciate it. A very pointed and hopefully easy question. Commissioner Keller, many of us have been looking forward with bated breath to the release of the list of values considered to be of high credential. I've been looking for it. When are we going to get it?
So, thanks for the question, Susan. And so we're actually working on this right now with the institution. So we have a working group with our as we're looking ahead to not just what's in the community college finance bill, but we have to think about, okay, this is a huge undertaking. What does implementation look like? So we're working with the colleges that are leaders on workforce education, like San Jacinto College, to better understand sort of how they organize those workforce programs, what's the data that they're looking at, sort of what's the underlying taxonomy, so we can make sure that we align the incentives with those programs that are not just credentials of value, but really align with those workforce needs. So when are you going to get the list? I think that what's going to happen is going to be that first we're collecting data from the community colleges over this next, say, month or so, working in close partnership with the Association of Community Colleges, to have a better understanding sort of what's the scope and scale of what folks are doing right now. And then we'll be looking at it through the lens of what our leading institutions have been doing so that we can break that down. And then that's what's going to help us generate the runs for the appropriations bill for the end of the session. But then we're not done. We're going to have to continue to iterate on this with the institutions, and also working in close partnership with my colleagues at TWC and with folks at the Texas Workforce Investment Council. I mean, so that we make sure that we've got a list that can be dynamic, can be dialed into those regional workforce needs over time. So it's not going to be a list that's instantiated in statute, or I hope it's never instantiated in statute. I hope what we have is the framework, and then through rulemaking and implementation, then we've got here's what we're seeing in the economy, here's our list of credentials overall, here's what that schedule looks like, here's what seems to be especially in high demand by different regions, and have the system be dynamic enough to be able to pick that up.
And I think that's the real key, making it dynamic, because it's not going to be a 5-year list. It's got to be really moving every 6-9 months or a year.
Well, that was a hard question, which you know, Susan.
For those online, we're getting a follow-up for more specifics on timing.
More specifics on timing. So we'll have a sort of preliminary snapshot of where folks are right now, kind of what, and I'll say, look, there's a ton going on in the colleges that we haven't collected data for at the state level. But what's striking is even the institutions themselves haven't necessarily been tracking the data the same way, or sometimes even centrally at all, because it hasn't really been funded by the state. So there's things going on in continuing education and workforce education that we need to bring more into the conversation and have more consistent data collection and reporting within and across the institutions.
I did want to ask about that, actually, the fact that there are aspects of continuing ed that there is not strong data from the colleges, even understanding which schools are offering which programs. How is the state, as they figure out this legislation to overhaul this funding system, how big of a problem is that for them as they're trying to work that out and kind of build this without the proper data?
Well, from an institutional standpoint, the commissioners formed this work group. We're working together. We've done some preliminary pieces of it. We understand it's a phased approach. I mean, we know we've got good data on the credit side, which are where most of our associate degrees and our certificate, or that's where all those are. On this continuing education piece, we see it being phases. How much of the whole formula will it be? I think that's difficult to even understand at this point. But we see phase one being easier to get, and then we'll just continue to evolve it. And again, it's one of those things, it's going to be all 50 colleges needing to be involved with this because we do things very differently in that area.
Yeah, so the initial implementation year will look different from the second year, will look different from the third year as we dial in kind of what the data collection looks like. But again, we want to make sure that this is aligned also with the kind of data that the colleges need to be able to make decisions about what they should offer, what they should scale, what they see happening in the regional and the state economy.
And how it aligns with what employers need. That's the big thing.
I want to go back to the question that we had about the PUF fund and the new endowment. $2.5 billion for, University of Houston, Texas Tech, and now the governor has included Texas State and University of North Texas. Doesn't seem like a whole lot of money for 4 universities compared to the amount of money that UT and A&M have from their PUF fund. And I'm wondering how you think this new endowment needs to be set up so that these schools can really see a return to be able to improve in the way that they want to in these national rankings.
Yeah, so I think it needs to be set up in a way that it's going to be, first of all, substantial out of the blocks, so you see immediate benefit. So this would be a dramatic enhancement to the endowments of these institutions, but this is something that's got to grow over time. So so if you look back to say 1980 or so, the PUF might have been worth $2.5 billion, something like that, maybe a little more. It's grown dramatically over time because of sound investment, but also because of the revenues that come in to that fund. So so the discussions right now are how do you create a fund that's going to grow over time to lift up multiple institutions so they can be nationally and internationally competitive.
I wanted to ask, this is a very different question, but this summer, Pell eligibility is going to come back for incarcerated students. And I'm wondering what the state and community colleges are thinking about to kind of maximize the benefit of that money for students and colleges and employers.
So we don't really do a lot with incarcerated or, and so I think there's some institutions that have a very significant programs around that, and that funding is critically important.
Yeah, so for some of our institutions, that will be very important for being able to expand those programs, so make sure that folks are able to be able to get good jobs, to be able to re-engage in the economy. The direction our economy is headed is almost all of our net new jobs and almost all of the good jobs, you have to have some kind of education and training beyond a high school diploma. And so we've got to dramatically expand access to that across the board, and that includes our students who are incarcerated to make sure that they've got skills that are going to be of value in our labor market.
Last question, this week you brought up, Commissioner Keller, there was some questions that you had from House Appropriations about tenure. And you said that it is a serious policy conversation that's important to have to figure out how tenure is aligned with what the lawmakers want to see from these institutions. Can you elaborate a bit more on what you meant by that and what kinds of conversations around tenure you think the state should be having? You said eliminating it would pull the rug out from under us or from under the state in terms of recruitment, but are there ways in which you think tenure could be reviewed or reformed?
So two things. First, we are in not just a national but an international competition for top talent. And the strength of our institutions, the strength of those research universities is going to turn on the talent that they're able to retain and they're able to attract to the institutions. The star faculty members routinely bring in 10 times their annual salary or more in external grants. They're doing consulting with industry. There's startups that come out of their labs. There's and they have a lot of options. And so we want to make sure that our Texas institutions and more of our Texas institutions are attractive destinations for that top talent. Part of the standard package for attracting that talent would be a commitment of tenure. The second thing I want to say is that, well, there's some mythologies about what tenure is and what it should entail. So tenure is meant to protect academic freedom, but the idea is not that you should be able to earn tenure and then guaranteed a job for life and now you can mail it in. So it's important that there's meaningful post-tenure review and management, good management practices to make sure that your faculty are productive, that they're on track for advancement in their disciplines, that they're continuing to contribute to the institutions, to their students, to their disciplines. And so where that isn't happening, then post-tenure review may in some cases mean that folks' tenure could be revoked. Our systems, unlike systems in some other states, already do have more robust post-tenure review practices in place than folks may realize. There actually are faculty who end up either resigning or relinquishing their tenure, or actually will go up and have their tenure revoked. I think having that be a little more visible and make sure that those good management practices are in place, I don't think is detrimental to the institution of tenure. I think actually it's important to make sure that it's serving its intended purpose.
Right. And to just wrap up, looking at the legislative session really briefly, what is at stake here when it comes to getting the funding that is needed for community colleges, 4 years, et cetera? What do you think is at stake this session?
The future of our state is at stake around higher education. Let's just be clear. I mean, I'm not kidding. If we think about the Texas that we want our children to live in, we want our grandchildren to live in, whether we're able to retain and advance our competitive position is going to turn on whether we're able to expand higher education opportunities to educate many more people to higher standards than we've ever achieved before. It's going to depend on whether we're able to compete at the frontiers of technology, of human knowledge, to be able to attract and retain business to Texas. Again, talent is increasingly mobile. There are a lot of places that employers can go. We want to make sure that Texas remains a premier destination and continues to lead the way. That is increasingly going to depend on the strength of Texas higher education. And so again, what I appreciate is our policymakers in Texas, I think, appreciate that. And so that's why, unlike other states, you see Texas policymakers coming strong out of the blocks with markers down that we are going to prioritize and invest in higher education for the future in Texas.
Great. With that, we are out of time. Thank you for joining us here and virtually, and thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate it. Thank you again to the Texas Tribune members who tuned in today. Once again, a reminder that Tribune supporters keep events like this free and accessible for all. The Tribune is a nonprofit news organization, and we rely on support from folks like you. If you value our events and journalism, join as a member at texastribune.org/donate. Thank you, everyone. Thank you both.